we'll get going in a minute. I have to say that one of the great frustrations I'm already having with this conference is that I can't walk over to people and have that 5-minute conversation and catch up about how's the job, how's the kids, how's the spouse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because I know all these people, pretty well, and there's something very constraining about always being on the screen. Though I know we have very nice, pleasant people who are watching this, but it kind of limits the chit chat. So for all of you, let's catch up, okay? I'm missing the the updates on all of you with that. So and also just again one more ad here. I just want to reaffirm that you are watching an event sponsored by Hagley, the leading institution of business history archives in the United States, with all sorts of great collections to use with funding for that purpose and events, things like that. We have a series which I'm going to ask Greg to put in the link in the chat called Hagley History Hangout, where Greg Hargreaves interviews people who have done research in our collections and written books or done things of that sort from there. For the people who have on this panel, you did research long enough ago that you probably weren't caught up in Greg's net, but Greg might be interested in doing more with you, especially if you have books coming out for that point there. But every 2 weeks, it's on audio and on YouTube with our collections there. And so we're doing a lot to let people know about the kind of research materials that we have. All right, that's your 1-minute ad is over. Let's get back to our business here. I titled this session International Avon because we have had some fabulous research done about the international activities of Avon. There's additional work about Avon International that's not used in our collections. A lot of it is very much anthropological, interview-based ethnography, South Africa in particular, some wonderful stuff there. So this is not the whole story, but we do have these resources because Avon was a big international company, and that's what this next session is going to be about. We're going to start with Emanuela Scarpellini, who is professor of modern history at the University of Milan. She has a very long and illustrious career. She currently also heads the research center, MIC, Moda, Imagery, Consumi, Fashion, Image, and Consumer Culture at the University of Milan. She has an armful of books published in Italian. 3 of them have been translated and are available here. Italian Fashion since 1945, A Cultural History, came out in 2019. Food and Foodways in Italy from 1861 to the present, which came out in 2016. And Material Nation, A Consumer's History of Modern Italy, 2011. And these are just the books in English that she has there. And part of Emanuela's research has been to look at Avon, Italy. The title of her talk is Transnational Beauty, Avon International in the Case of Italy. So go ahead, Emanuela.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me and organizing. Thanks. And I'm very glad to be here also because I remember when I came for, now years ago to visit Hagley Archives, I find out this precious and wonderful collection about Avon. And then I had the idea to start working on this topic. And then when I came back to Italy, I also started to look at the Italian side of the story. And I found something because the problem is that I found some public documents, for instance, about the role of the corporation of the company in the production, but again, it was very difficult to access the private corporate archives in Italy. But the other part of my research was trying to interview the Avon ladies again, oral history, and it was not very simple because I try also to interview the, so to say, old Avon ladies. So the people who were working for the company, probably at the beginning, that is to say 1960s and 1970s, because they were more attached, they had more this corporate identity. And anyway, I will tell you the story while showing you, if I succeed to. Okay, here. So Transnational Beauty is the the title, and in this case, I will concentrate on the case of Italy. Well, the point, my starting point was that in this case, we are talking in a phase of, how can I call, pre-globalization, because we are talking about the 1960s. So Avon had started to create new plants in Latin America, and then it decided to move toward Europe. Europe means in particular Germany, France, and then UK, and Italy in the 1964. So I think that the first point that struck me was that they found some difficulties in Europe, and they immediately faced the problems of the adaptation, cultural and productive adaptation. In a sense, well, my opinion was that they were prepared to face some adaptation in countries with a very different cultural background. They were not prepared to face many problems in, for instance, in Europe, but they found them for many reasons. For instance, talking about the case of Italy, since we have very little time, well, we can start with here. The period was particularly happy because after the difficult years after the Second World War, during the 60s, Italy experienced, like other European countries, a sort of a big economic expansion, the so-called economic miracle. So it was a period of optimism, of growing per capita income, and this is an image, a typical iconic image of Milan during the 1960s. And you see the traffic, the lights, people very elegant. So this was the idea of modernity coming. And in many cases, modernity in their eyes was also a modernity coming following the American dream, the American way of life. And Avon was a sort of also an embodiment somewhat of this message. But talking about Italy, there were some problems. Well, the first problem was that the cosmetic industry was not well developed. In many cases, well, there was a cosmetic, of course, the chemical industry, but in many cases, the characteristic was that, as you can see here, the majority of the enterprises were very small. That is to say, usually more than half had from 1 to 5 employees. So there was a lack of mass production of cosmetic products. And that could be also a favorable starting point from Avon. The second point was the retail distribution, the retail chain. Again, the traditional situation was so that the cosmetic products were sold usually in perfumeries, and that was especially for the high class and expensive products, or pharmacies. And that was very traditional, as in many other countries. There was the idea that hygiene was more important than beauty. But in following this path, there was a possibility to sell something that was in between hygiene and beauty. Again, so this was a second problem for Avon. And this is also the reason why the tactics of door-to-door selling was particularly effective. And then there was the problem of the cultural dimension, because we saw the image of the modern Milan, so to say, but in the same time we have the image, this is exactly the same time in Sicily, very traditional, and particularly the problem of women. There was still very strong the idea of the traditional role of women inside of the family. And even the public appearance, the external appearance, should be very carefully studied, because, for instance, the use of makeup in general, lipstick and so on, was considered often not appropriate for a serious woman. Especially that was used for women in public space, and the influence of the Catholic Church was particularly strong in the 90s, and I would say until the end of the 60s. So what Avon did, Avon came in the moment of a change where, thanks to the economic miracle we talked before, there was a changement also in the employment, with many more women going to work, to factory, to farms, and so on. And in this way, these women experience a new idea of a public identity, a new femininity, if you would like to call it, where they can use also makeup and lipstick and perfumes and other things in a very, appropriate way. So I would say they were experiences, new ways of proposing their femininity and their new identity outside the family in the society. And this is why I think that the Avon, in this case, was particularly important. Again, this is an advertisement of 1952, and I noticed that in this case, well, they use the traditional famous superstar, Eva Gardner, but the Lux is a perfume soap. So this was a way also used by Avon to create a bridge between the traditional hygiene product and the new cosmetic product, a perfume soap. No one could say, well, it's a luxury. Still, it was perfume. And well, and so this is the image of the first plan built in the northern part of Italy, and it produced a lot of products, basically covered the Italian market and partly the part of the European market. One point I was interested is that would they produce exactly the same products manufactured, for instance, in the United States? Well, the answer is basically yes and no. Well, yes, in general. In some cases, they were exactly the same. But there were some differences, especially starting from the 1970s. And in many cases, what they did, they changed the external packaging or the way the same product was marketed to Italy, trying to accommodate the local, cultural, even stereotype. So basically, in many cases, they were the same, but they were sold in a different way or using different messages. And finally, I already said that the door-to-door sales technique was particularly affected also because of the situation of the retail chain in selling the cosmetic product in Italy. And I would say that, well, my last question is here. At the beginning, even their newsletter, there were a lot of ads coming from United States. This is a typical traditional Avon ladies ads. And they will use these ads also in Italy. But of course, it is clear without saying that these are sort of, I don't know, kind of top model to my eyes, or, very high, slender, blonde, blue eyes, probably, whatever. What was the impact of this imagery upon Avon ladies and the customers in Italy? Well, my idea was that maybe they could react in a negative way, but according to my interviews, that was not the case. They accepted, they were very happy with this image. At the same time, we can see in the newsletter, even Avon Italy used the real Avon ladies. In this case, you see the housewife, the employees, the young employees, and then the students. And one Avon lady, now older Avon lady, told me, well, there is not a problem because we know that there is this image, this wonderful things of stars coming from America through the movies, through Avon, whatever. And this is an ideal, I would say, is an ideal typus that we have, but we know that there is also the reality. So the two images coexisted without conflict in their minds. So it was not a rejection toward an unattainable beauty, but it was a way to say, well, this is their image, but we have to change, adapt this image to the reality. And there is no contrast, no conflict. And this is probably why even coming to our day and to the problems that also Tina remember about the internet and this difficult evolution. Anyway, the brand Avon became so strong and so grounded even in the Italian market, I would say, until nowadays. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Emanuela. A Zoom applause here for that. Our next presenter is Shawn Moura, who is Director of Research at NAIOP, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association, where he oversees research on topics related to office, industrial, and mixed-use property development. He has a PhD in history from the University of Maryland, and his dissertation was titled Development Begins at Home, Women and the Domestic Economy in Brazil, 1945 to 1975. And there he examined the evolution of women's gender roles and the cultural politics of modernization in Brazil. Shawn, go ahead.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you to all the staff at Hagley who've helped to organize this colloquium. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So the fourth chapter of my dissertation examines Avon's entry into the Brazilian market with a focus on how it adapted its strategy to Brazilian gender norms and in the process accelerated its recruitment and sales to working class, rural, and Afro-Brazilian women. The Hagley's Avon collection provides insight into how Avon organizes international branches and translated a gender division of labor that had developed in the United States to new contexts. As Katina mentioned, the archive is very corporate heavy, and what we see from Brazil is largely information from the international division's interactions with general branch managers, as well as all of the marketing materials that the Brazilian branch sent back to Avon HQ. Now, the period that I'm looking at from 1958 until the mid-1970s, Avon adopted a decentralized model for managing its international branches. Each international branch was encouraged to develop its own products and advertisements and to adapt its marketing strategy to national contexts, which is why a lot of the materials that you would expect to find are probably still somewhere in Brazil. The marketing materials that the Brazilian branch sent back to Avon's US headquarters provide a glimpse of how local managers and saleswomen had modified recruiting and sales practices to accommodate conservative Brazilian gender norms. As I mentioned earlier, I was fortunate to also have access to interviews conducted by Museu da Pessoa with former Avon managers and saleswomen in Brazil that revealed additional information about the branch's operation, as well as saleswomen's lived experience. So when the branch opened in 1958, it was largely the result of efforts made by the international division, which invested quite a bit of capital in the opening of the first plant in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which at that time was the largest cosmetics plant in South America. The international division recruited American-born managers to operate the Brazilian branch, provided the capital for that factory, and also played a role in training the branch's managers and staff in Avon's sales strategy and culture. On the left of the slide, we can see images from the plant's opening, which is attended by representatives of the international division, as well as senior branch staff. And then a newspaper clipping provides an aerial shot of the plant at its opening. As in the US, the Brazilian branch adopted a gender division of labor between male managers, accountants, and operations staff, and an all-female sales force organized by women who trained and supplied saleswomen. These women, called promoters, served as a link between management and saleswomen, but were not themselves considered for promotion to middle or senior management. They're very analogous to the city sales managers in the US, who are women as well. Avon in part motivated promoters and saleswomen through recurring sales contests. So here we see an image from a 1968 sales contest that rewarded promoters and the saleswomen working under them with bonuses for the most productive territories. The promoters were responsible for the top territories would be crowned the queens of Avon's anniversary party. So in this image, we see a successful promoter on a raised dais being crowned by a male executive. Although she's the queen of the show, the man's presence reflected Avon's gendered organizational hierarchy and naturalized male leadership. Although the Brazilian branch excluded women from middle and upper management positions until the 1980s, this reliance on saleswomen forced it to quickly adapt to Brazilian gender norms and class divisions. Avon had initially planned to recruit middle-class saleswomen to work defined sales territories in Rio and Sao Paulo, Brazil's two largest consumer markets. This page from a Panorama newsletter from 1959 instructed saleswomen on how they should work a defined sales territory. While Avon products were priced to be attainable by working-class women, the company assumed that its products would be most appealing to middle-class consumers interested in the status associated with the North American brand, and hoped to recruit promoters who could afford their own cars to manage large sales territories. Once established in Rio and Sao Paulo, Avon would then expand to other markets and extend recruitment to working-class women. At least that was the plan, but not everything went to plan. Interviews with former sales managers revealed that they struggled to recruit middle-class women throughout this period, in large part because of Brazilian gender norms that frowned on women working unless it was economically necessary. Remaining at home was a marker of class status. Many middle-class Brazilians perceived women working in the street as susceptible to casual sexual relationships. The Brazilian branch responded to conservative middle-class gender norms by recruiting working-class saleswomen much earlier than it had intended, and by portraying Avon sales as a respectable activity that was compatible with traditional middle-class feminine roles. Ads such as this one from 1959 portrayed women in conservative middle-class attire and in domestic settings. This ad tells us that the elegant Brazilian woman chooses Avon cosmetics in her home. Reflecting the intersection of racial and class hierarchies in Brazil, Avon ads exclusively featured white women until 1970. Though it is clear from the other sources that the company recruited Afro-Brazilian saleswomen in the 1960s. Panorama newsletters and marketing materials distributed to saleswomen also sought to portray sales as an activity that would be financially rewarding, while helping women to fulfill traditional roles as mothers and wives. So here we see an image from a 1967 campaign that rewarded top-performing saleswomen with consumer goods. Aside from the Volkswagen, most of the items featured in the promotion, such as cookware, china, and a sewing machine, were closely associated with traditional feminine domestic roles. In addition to aspirational campaigns rewarded top saleswomen, Panorama also frequently emphasized the earnings potential of selling Avon products. A 1960 Panorama indicated that a woman could make 3,200 cruzeiros a week by selling 2 to 4 items to 40 customers per week at a 20% commission. Extrapolated to a monthly income, this would be equivalent to 143% of the minimum salary in Rio de Janeiro in the last quarter of 1960. An income high enough that when combined with the husband making the minimum salary would be enough to elevate a household from the working poor to middle-class status as defined by the Brazilian Institute of Public Opinion Statistics, a prominent market research firm. It's worth noting that not every woman was making that kind of income, but those who were most active did have the opportunity to earn a relatively high income in a low-wage country. Avon sales could thus appear quite attractive to working-class women, especially when compared with the low-wage, low-prestige jobs in which women often worked, such as textiles or domestic labor. Panoramas also included honor rolls with brief profiles in which top saleswomen explained why they sold Avon and how they used the commissions they received. Several of these from 1967 shed light into the class status and ambitions of active saleswomen. In most cases, the featured saleswomen aspired to use Avon sales to obtain a middle-class standard of living or support their families. For example, Astrogilda Jorozinski, pictured on the left, used the proceeds from Avon sales to pay for her daughter's tuition at a good high school. Iracema Souza Castro, pictured in the middle, an Afro-Brazilian saleswoman, used her income from Avon to provide more stability and security for her family. She framed her commissions as a financial aid to her husband that also allowed her to buy all of her daughter's clothes. Bernadette Santos, on the right, began selling Avon after the death of her husband and used commission to support herself and her 2 children. In some instances, the profiles also revealed saleswomen's ambitions to increase their financial independence. Miodo Carmo Nunes, pictured on the left here, used her income from Avon to reduce her reliance on her adult children to begin saving for a home of her own. On the right, we see a picture of Hilda Salaberry Gomez, who's saving up to buy a car that would allow her to expand her business. Gomez's aspiration to expand her business also reflected a trend that managers quickly observed. Saleswomen largely ignored sales territories that had been defined for them, instead selling through personal networks that often extended far beyond the markets officially targeted by Avon's branch headquarters. Interviews reveal that official Avon saleswomen further expanded their networks by splitting commissions with other women who were located outside official sales territories or who only wanted to make occasional sales without committing to regular sales meetings. While well-dressed white women dominated Avon's advertising in the 1960s, the company effectively created new economic opportunities for working class, Afro-Brazilian, and rural women. These saleswomen in turn expanded access to cosmetics to women who were located far from downtown salons, boutiques, and department stores, or who may have felt uncomfortable sampling cosmetics in retail locations that primarily catered to white middle-class women. By 1970, branch managers clearly recognized the size of the Afro-Brazilian market and began portraying Afro-Brazilian women and men in its advertisements, as can be seen in several ads from that year, such as those pictured here. This shift in advertising also happened to coincide with the opening of a new, larger plant in the Interlagos neighborhood of Sao Paulo, which had more assembly lines and could produce a broader range of cosmetics. In this slide, we see an advertisement for a new leg makeup product, which includes a reference to a color guide. The color guide was also included in this batch of campaign mailings and includes colors for darker skin tones. Avon's shift to recruiting working class women and managers' tolerance of sales networks that extended outside official channels and sales territories helped Avon rapidly become the most widely owned brand in several lines of cosmetics in the 1960s, including among both middle class and working class Brazilians. Here we see a chart illustrating Avon's market penetration in 5 of the most commonly owned cosmetics products in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, based on data obtained by the Brazilian Institute of Public Opinion and Statistics. Avon quickly became the dominant brand in perfume and lipstick. By 1965, Avon was the most widely owned brand in 11 product categories in Rio de Janeiro, with 50% or more of consumers who owned cologne, perfume, cleansing cream, base cream, hair removal lotion, hair lotion, and hand cream reporting that they owned an Avon branded product. Although several other cosmetics and toiletries brands were widely owned in a narrow range of products, no other brand was as widely owned in so many product categories as Avon between 1961 and 1971. In conclusion, Avon's foray into the Brazilian market reveals that the company had to reconcile its objective of becoming a leading brand among middle-class urban consumers with the reality that it was more successful at recruiting working-class women. In the process, the company had to strike a balance between appearing respectable to middle-class women while also convincing working-class women that selling Avon was a worthwhile endeavor. Although Avon advertisements and panorama newsletters catered to conservative gender norms by portraying sales as compatible with women's traditional roles as mothers and wives, Avon sales also provide an avenue for particularly active saleswomen to increase their financial independence. Avon's direct-to-home distribution model, powered largely by working-class women attracted to the flexibility and income potential of cosmetic sales, proved to be very popular in Brazil, which eventually became Avon's largest market outside the United States. Avon's success led rival cosmetics brand Natura to adopt a direct sales model in 1974, facilitating that company's rapid expansion and its eventual acquisition of Avon in 2020. And that's all for my presentation.
Great, thank you, Shawn. Again, the weirdness of Zoom, we can't make noise to say thank you for these presentations and all that. So I'll make the noise. Thank you very much for all that. Stay on. And now we're going to hear from Jessica Chelikis, who is trained as an anthropologist and is now lecturer of sustainability and global value chains, and a member of the marketing and corporate brand research group at Brunel Business School, United Kingdom. And I thought my title was long. That's a mouthful, but it's a lot of stuff that you're doing. Her past research has examined the nexus of gender and direct sales and household economies, discourses of microfinance, critical perspectives on developing markets, and social change, and sociocultural scales of analysis. She walks in a lot of different fields. The journal articles go into journals such as Economic Anthropology, Journal of International Management, Journal of Business Research, and Journal of Marketing Management. So Jessica goes in a lot of directions with the kind of research she's doing. Now she's looking at the relationship between, in her future work, between sleep and temporal narratives in middle-class consumers' sleep-related consumption. Her research was part of the dissertation that she worked on, I believe, and her talk today is called Avon in the Brazilian Amazon, Direct Sales and Consumption Among Vulnerable Communities. Go ahead, Jessica.
Thank you, Roger. And yeah, it's a nice way of saying I can't settle on one research topic for very long. All right, let me share my screen. There we go. Right, so this was, as Roger mentioned, part of my dissertation research, which was really a while ago now. I conducted this research between 2008, 2009, and I was doing my anthropology PhD at Indiana University. And whenever I told anyone that I was studying women buying and selling Avon in the Amazon, They always thought it was surprising. Oh, the Amazon, people buy makeup there, really? And it was surprising because it contradicts the images that a lot of us have about Amazonia. We usually think of exotic natives living in a jungle, presumably with very little contact with the world of mass-produced goods and consumer culture. But they are consumers, just in very different circumstances. And it's certainly different from the middle-class consumption of the developed world that we're all accustomed to. So this is what I wanted to investigate, the socioeconomic role of Avon and other direct sales companies in Amazonia households. So just for a little bit of context, this map here shows the state of Pará. If you look at the bottom, it's highlighted where it is in Brazil. And I was working in a municipality called Ponta de Pedras that's located on Marajó Island. And Ponta de Pedras is just right across the bay from the major metropolitan city of Belém. And this is basically where I spent my time, just really following Avon ladies around and interviewing them and following them on sales calls. And I actually worked in 3 different communities. So there's the town of Ponta de Pedras, that's where the main harbor is. That's where the local Avon coordinator lives, where all shipments from Belém are received. They arrive by boat. But I also worked in 2 interior communities, in the river interior, which is accessible only by boat, but also one of the upland interior communities, which you can get to by the road. Now, I had already extensively studied the historical and cultural context of the Brazilian Amazon for my studies. But I knew very little about the history of Avon, or Avon in Brazil and in Amazonia. So that is why before I started my research, I visited Hagley. I spent 2 weeks looking at the Avon archives for Brazil. And basically, Shawn summarized much more in depth and more elegantly the kind of material that I was looking at. Yeah, so I was actually really happy that you went first, Shawn, because also I had lost a lot of my notes and some of the photocopies I had made from that period. This was a little bit before cloud storage. I did manage to dig out the 2 photocopies that I had made, one from both from Panorama magazine, 1959, 1963. What struck me about these early ones, as Shawn pointed out, they're still like very American images. And what struck me about these were particularly not so much the models, but the Americanness of the doors, right? So the doors with the knockers on them and the 2 women talking over a white picket fence. I think for the Brazilian audience at this time, nobody would have confused this for a Brazilian setting. This is purely American. And it was interesting to see that shift that Shawn pointed out in the 70s, or beginning in the 70s. So that gave me the overview, right, of the historical context in Brazil, but then I needed to learn a little more about, how did Avon arrive into the community that I was interested in the Amazon in Ponta de Pedras. And I was able to interview one of the first Avon representatives in Ponta de Pedras. She and her husband were recruited in 1979 from a manager in Belém. Her husband operated a boat that went between Belém and Ponta de Pedras. So he was able to carry orders and shipments and products back and forth between Ponta de Pedras and Belém. And really, I mean, things have, in terms of technology and in terms of transportation, things have improved. But that is still how Avon products arrive. They arrive by boat. And even while I was there was a story of some Avon boxes going overboard while the boat was in the harbor, and a few Avon representatives commented, "Oh, okay, so that's why my products arrived slightly damp." But what struck me the most, what I kind of want to mostly talk about today, is this kind of disjuncture between the kind of self-help entrepreneurial ethos that comes out in a lot of the Avon literature, especially the Panorama magazine, and Avon meetings, when managers lead monthly meetings for their representatives. This idea of what was emphasized at the time when I was doing my field work, the idea of building your dream, right? You want to sell Avon, or women were encouraged to sell Avon to achieve some kind of material transformation in their lives. And before I went over to Content Prejudice, in the very early stages, first weeks of my fieldwork, I stayed in Berlin and I interviewed an Avon manager there. And something she said really stuck with me. She said, nobody wants to sell Avon juice because it's a fun thing to do. And she really emphasized to me this idea of building and not just trying to make pocket change, but trying to like send your children to a good school or university, to buy a house, to buy a car. A lot of the things she mentioned were the things that Shawn talked about in those highlights of women from the 1970s, saying why they wanted to, or why they sold Avon. And so a lot of it stayed the same in terms of these things that they would mention. Why should we sell Avon? So she talked about this, and I was impressed. There was a local manager kind of really sticking to this corporate script. And then I arrived in Content Prejudice. And right away, this was what I encountered. And it was unexpected. It didn't occur to me that actually one of the fundamental issues of being an Avon or any kind of direct sales representative in Prejudice was the fact that your customers may not pay you what they owe you after placing an order. So this became almost everything that I was obsessed with during my year in the Amazon, just to understand, why is direct sales financially risky for women in Amazonia, and why do they keep doing it anyway? So just to, there were many kind of reasons for this, but the one that I'll focus on today is the fact that they have to sell on credit. What I mean by that is usually the arrangement, the kind of standard arrangement that representatives would work out with customers, is that when they would deliver, their product orders to their customers, the customer would pay for half of what they owed at that point, and then arrange to make subsequent payments over the next month, maybe 2 months, with the representative. But what could also happen is that the Avon representative comes back, following month. Oh, I'm here to collect the rest of my payment. Oh, I don't have it for you. The customer will respond. My husband got sick, or we had this emergency, something came up. I can't pay you. Can you please just come back next month? So this was an extremely common occurrence. And the thing is that so what this reflected was the kind of precarity or irregularity of incomes in these communities. And many of the direct sales representatives would often be in this similar situation as their customers. I held a focus group with a group of about 6 direct sales representatives, many of them working for Avon. And I didn't know it at the time. Only afterward, I found out that one of them was in debt to another representative that was there at the meeting. And so there was this underlying tension going on that I was completely oblivious to. So to wrap things up, contrary to what the manager in Belém told me, nobody wants to sell Avon because it's a fun thing to do. But I found out in Prejudice actually that is a big reason why they sell Avon. They really like it. They like looking at products. They like seeing catalogs. They like talking about the products. Another interesting thing is that even though it's hard to make a substantial profit for them, it actually does create a meaningful, even though small, source of occasional income, and it gives them more authority in household decision. They also like it because it's basically a way of buying this kind of product. If you work as a representative, many women said that they would sell just enough to cover the cost of something that else that they wanted to buy. So this was another strategy and reason or value for selling Avon in Amazon. So these are, just to really wrap things up now, the broad strokes conclusions from my dissertation. So in a place like Ponte de Ethos that's underdeveloped, actually the fact that it's underdeveloped and a lot of the residents don't have access to shopping malls and shopping centers the way that you would in the city, it actually creates demand for catalog products. But it also restricts the low disposable income, the precarity of their income also restricts what they can buy and therefore what the Avon representatives can earn. Traditional gender roles also constrain women's earning potential. The obligation of informal credit means that the representatives themselves might fall into debt doing this, but they still value this. It's still very important to them, and it gives them what I call a non-transformational power. They're not changing their lives in a major significant way, but it is helping in small ways to improve their lives on a much smaller scale. That's it from me.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. I had to put on my microphones here. Well, thank you so much for that, Jessica. First, like our last session, I want to see if any of you have a thought, a question, or a comment. People, I'm talking to the panel here, and then people who are in the audience, as it were, shoot some questions in on the chat, and Greg will share them with everybody. So anybody who I'm looking at here on the screen will respond to anybody else in terms of presentations, topics, international Avon, Italy, Brazil. Yes, Lindsay.
Hi, this was amazing. First of all, Roger, you also look like a radio sports broadcaster. So anyway, I like that look on you.
Shucks.
So I present here in a few minutes, but I had international chapters, and you're all bringing me back to research where I saw so many materials on Brazil when I was doing my research. And I remember reading annual reports in my English only world and being like, wow, there's a lot going on there. And clearly between Shawn and Jessica, you both hit on questions I had 10 years ago. Jessica, I must have missed you by a couple years at the Hagley, but I think, anyway, this is just more of a comment of I always was really curious about sort of the developing country angle from Avon. First contact was in Puerto Rico, which I had a chapter on. So you see sort of like US state power development going, and then figuring out how it actually worked on the ground. I could never really get a handle on because again, I was doing more sort of corporate PR analysis. And so anyway, I just wanted to say that you both just answered questions that I've had for a decade. And especially Shawn, the idea of sort of the inadvertent strategy of incorporating working class women, which was not the Avon brand image, but I think to this day still is the powerhouse of how it works around the world. And then Jessica, people have asked about Amazon, Avon ladies to me in the past, and now I know where to turn them to. And so at any rate, less questions and more just comments of how awesome both of your presentations were. So thank you.
Great. Any of you want to respond to Lindsay's thoughts?
I can say thank you. Jessica, actually, I had a follow-up question or observation. So you point out the pictures of the doors and the very American kind of look. And I think there's a reason for that. The managers reported and the salespeople reported that they struggled when they first got to Brazil because all the Avon materials are about ringing a doorbell, and there were no doorbells in Brazil. And people weren't used to direct door-to-door sales like they were in the US. So people would knock on a door and no one would show up. And so in a lot of the materials they sent to Brazilian consumers or images and advertisements, there's lots of emphasis on the door and coming to the door and come answer the door, please, because otherwise people just stay in there. And I suspect that probably is why you're seeing a lot of that.
In both of the ads that you showed with Brazil, those are American models, and they're American ads that have just been modeled. I don't know, you mentioned the Puerto Rico ad when they first went, and did you see the hand-drawn ad where they had, you know, the American model, and to make her more Latina, there's just pen marks like for the hair to make the hair more sleek and sculpted. It was, so those doors in that model were American models that they were trying to transplant.
Yeah, there are about 5 different versions of that 1959 ad that I had up that are for different markets.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jessica, too, because that was very early in the research when that New York Times article came out about selling Avon and lipstick in the Amazon, right? And it was always presented as kind of exploitation of consumers, right? That the Avon lipsticks were so much money compared to the average household income. So I really appreciate that you and Shawn, the way that it kind of sculpted into more a conversation about the women who are selling, which and what it did with them, and same too with Emanuela in Italy, of trying hard to transplant that American middle class ideal into other countries. And it's always astonishing how some elements of it translate so well around the world, and others don't.
Yeah, I just want to say, I kind of echo, I just want to echo what Lindsay said. I just wish that, like, we just missed each other probably at Hagley. It would have been nice for all of us to be able to meet up at some point. But it was also just really fun to revisit. I hadn't actually looked at this dissertation material for some years. And I had a really good time going back and revisiting it, and then hearing all of these presentations. And yeah, I was looking through my dissertation, so how many references to Menko appear. so yeah, this has been really fun. Kind of inspired me to kind of think about further. Oh, should I go back? Should I continue? And then, oh, I've already got so many things still going. But yeah, I just want to say thanks again for inviting me.
I have a question from Peter Leopold. All the speakers have mentioned product production in country. And is this common for home sales, or is it specific to Avon? And did Avon have quality control and cost saving for mass production concerns?
I can speak to that, at least in the Brazilian context. When Avon entered Brazil, it was a period where the Brazilian government was encouraging import substitution industrialization with protective tariffs. So it was much more affordable to open a plant in Brazil than to import products and resell them. When Avon made that investment, it was the largest cosmetics plant, which gave it advantages of scale compared to most of the other products that it was competing against. So it was able to produce goods at a much lower cost relative to its competition.
Yeah, maybe I can add also that for Europe in particular, that well, the Avon had this preoccupation of mass production, and so this is why also in Italy they started a major plan serving Italy, but partly also part of the other European country. But after at the end of the 70s and the 80s, they basically moved and create another bigger plant in Poland. And after that, another one in Russia. And so they concentrate all the production in basically for Europe in these two plants, now in Poland and in Russia. So the idea was a sort of a centralization of the production exactly to meet this problem of, try to have a very good basic low cost production.
If I could ask a question that touches on both the manufacturing aspect, I would love to talk to all of you more about what's going on in international manufacturing for Avon. Often direct selling companies are thought of as marketing companies, but also have significant manufacturing components. So we don't often think of them as manufacturers. But I'm also wondering about the perhaps the Cold War context of international expansion, and related to what Shawn mentioned around import substitution. What if any, or what do you know about perhaps like the role of diplomatic or government relations in the kind of Cold War context of American expansion?
I can speak to that again in the Brazilian context. So when Avon entered Brazil in 1958, 1959, it was at a period where the Juscelino Kubitschek government was very engaged with the US in international relations. So it was relatively a friendly environment, though there were very high tariffs, but they did encourage companies to invest in Brazil. In 1960 to 1964, there was quite a bit of turbulence in the Brazilian government, where the populist government was elected and then overthrown in a coup. But throughout that, Avon had already essentially invested all its resources and was able to remit, to the best of my knowledge, its profits without really losing anything through that process.
Other responses to Jessica's question? Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I think this isn't the chapter I'm presenting, but I do get a sense from like sort of early 50s Cold War memos from male executives in the United States that they very much saw direct selling as an extension of a very specific form of American uplift. And I remember reading, like, a lot of it had to do, I don't have a specific example, I'd have to look at my stuff, but like of having a specific person go and meet with diplomats to sort of introduce direct selling as a legitimate form of business. And so that often, I think, happened before they would eyeball a territory. So in that sense, sort of Cold War public relations had a lot to do with reframing direct selling as a real economic opportunity. And it was very US paternalistic, let us bring this amazing thing to your country. And I think Puerto Rico, and when you see Latin America, I'm not sure if it worked as well in Europe. I think Emanuela could probably speak more to that, but like very much sort of hierarchy of, again, sort of first world, let us bring these amazing things and uplift your people. And again, by the way, Shawn and Jessica showed that actually really like did happen in small and big ways too. So I think it's a mixed message, but from a management perspective was very much framed as a diplomatic enterprise before it sort of trickled down to opening a new place. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe I can add something also for the, I would say that, yes, there was this problem during the Cold War, and this was very much perceived in both Western and Eastern Europe as the American message, the American way of life, the American product. And so it's not by chance that as soon as it was possible, even the production moved toward East. It was a problem of costs, of course, but it was also a political stance somewhat. To enter into this market started with very popular consumer goods. And we have also to remember that after, in the 1990s, basically, there was another wave of expansion towards, Far East, considering US, that is to say China, first of all, and other countries in the South Asia areas and so on. And this was the most important. It became, for at least for a while, the most important market. Then they have also political problems with China because, as you probably know, China for a period banned the door-to-door sales. So Avon was had to create some other channels, for instance, inside other shops, so to start keep on with their businesses, and then came back. And in the end, we know that they were particularly effective and successful in Korea, because we know that now the former Avon is split between the Brazilian Natura and the Korean company. So there is this political problem in the background, for sure.
Yeah. In Latin America and in Brazil in particular, especially in the earlier part of this period, in the 50s and 1960s, a lot of Latin American governments were holding out the advances in consumer goods production and consumption itself as a way of raising a standard of living as an alternative to a socialist standard. And so Avon kind of fit into that, and in a lot of ways, consuming something like Avon that's modern and American was seen as a way of showing, oh yeah, we can attain a middle class standard of living, like an American standard of living, if we continue down this course of consumerist development.
I have a question from.
Can
Oh,
I just
go ahead, Katina.
About this question, because in my mind, it's not just about the American way of life, but when we get into the 1980s and 90s, it's about exporting feminism. And it would maybe be helpful if in the future scholars look at this not just as within the box of Avon, but within the direct selling industry as a larger unit. I know that Mary Kay was one of the first ones into the former Soviet Union when it broke apart, and their message was distinctly feminist as well as capitalist. And that too is what made some problems over in China. Weight Watchers International in the export of franchises, which isn't quite direct selling, but too carried a very feminist message in the 90s. So, extending past the Cold War messaging, there's other kind of distinctly American trends that get exported through how people are taught about what direct sales is and what it can do.
Great.
A question from Kelly Goodman. If the Avon ladies are only making modest profits, who is really making money off of sales in Brazil, Italy, and perhaps other places?
Well, I can say, or maybe clarify a little bit for the rural Amazonian context that I was working in. It's the idea, or what frustrated the local Avon coordinator himself and her manager, was that they thought there was potential to earn a lot more money for these Avon workers. They just weren't working hard enough. So I think the idea was that it's always about the potential. You could potentially make a lot of money, and I think in Brazil, especially if you went to the cities or at least to less rural and remote places in the Amazon, then you probably would find representatives, like a handful of them, that would be making substantial profits. It's just that they're not, they don't represent the majority of Avon representatives, and then they're completely absent in rural places in Amazon. And I think, but those who are studying corporate Avon could maybe say a little more about who is making the profits.
Yeah, I would second that. There were a handful of very successful saleswomen, and a lot of them were successful because, well, Avon is not a multi-tier marketing organization. They effectively turned it into one by splitting commissions with people who were less committed to being full-time sales representatives. Also, there was, especially after the 1970s, in the 1980s, promoters, those women I talked about who are kind of like the city sales managers, they did get a path into middle and upper management in the Avon branch. So there was a career path for them beyond just the sort of frontline sales manager role.
Yeah, and the profits just clearly who's making it is the company. It's not a big secret that the vast majority of Avon ladies work for a very short time and earn a very small amount of money. There are those who are held up as kind of these super sales to shoot for. The dirty secret in Avon back in the 90s was that the top sales agents or the top sales in terms of wholesale orders were warehousers. They were not doing it door to door at all, but that's where the vast majority are. And of course it creates, for historians and for analysts, this question of what point does this turn into exploitation? Is it simply that using a social network for personal sales? That line for me is very fuzzy and it's very broad though. And I was never willing to call Avon's and the direct sales as exploitative of labor or consumers. But it certainly raises that question about where do we want to set our markers.
Okay.
If I could just add about the who actually makes a lot of money, it's certainly the corporation, but I study direct sales firms, both multi-level and other, and it is often the case, especially in multi-level corporations, but also that the people who are making a lot of money are sometimes making it on peripheral sales. So sometimes people sell sales aids to the people that they recruit, or they sell motivational books or other kinds of things that are there where the cosmetics or whatever the item that is purported to being sold is in some ways a pathway to selling other things.
Any more comments on this question? I'm gonna let this discussion run over a bit because nobody has to come in the room after us, and we have another panel here. But this is a good conversation. So great, keep on pulling out some questions from the chat.
Sure, I've got from Vicky Howard asks if Avon seems like a great example of glocalization, if you'll pardon the jargon, and Vicky wonders whether Avon is spreading American holidays or other traditions around the globe, or perhaps adapting local traditions and holidays to sell their own products.
Any of you want to comment on this, please do.
Maybe I would say both. I mean, in a sense, they are also pushing some American holiday. For instance, but this is not only a case of Avon. For instance, in Europe now, it's very common to Halloween has become more important, which was. And now we have even the Cyber Friday, and and other, holidays. So they are trying both to exploit this commercial, I would say artificial somewhat holidays, and also to use the local holidays. So I think this is a very common strategy to combine both traditions.
Yeah, I can actually speak to that a little bit, and also to an earlier question about adapting products. So the Brazilian branch started to really introduce their own graphic design and their own branded products in the early 1960s. And you see a subtle shift away from very American-looking women to more and more Brazilian-looking women, even though they were still white by Brazilian standards. There was the traditions and holidays of Brazil are very similar to those in the US, but you can see some examples of them marketing to Brazilian customs, such as a 13th salary around the holiday. So that's an example where they were adapting a little bit more to local norms.
Anybody else? All right, great. We got some more. Or we?
Yeah. When production decisions were moved in country, Denise Sutton wonders whether it changed, resulted in products being created more specifically for the market. For example, related to skin tones, etc.
Yeah, so again, that's really something in Brazil happens kind of overnight from 1969 to 1970, where suddenly there's a lot of advertisements for dark-skinned women, and product catalogs showing darker skin tones. Before then, you would still see some darker skin tones in the actual products, even though they weren't in the advertisements. There weren't as much of a selection. I think a lot of that's attributable to, again, the opening of a larger plant that could have more lines, so they could have a more differentiated range of products that were on offer.
And one observation I've drawn from these people at various points over the last 20 years is that Avon, in the countries and locations they're in, might alter the product mix. There's the products they thought might sell might not sell, and so they would push other kinds of products in other particular areas that fit more closely with the demand of those consumers. I'm summarizing all of you. I hope if I'm wrong about what your argument is, you can now disagree with me that I've gotten you all wrong.
No, I also agree. I can also add another small thing, that in many cases, the Avon company stressed the fact that the sort of national identity of the production. For instance, in the case of Italy, when the Avon products were produced in north of Milan, in many cases, there was a label produced in Italy, something like made in Italy or something like that. So they also try even to advertise their, contribution to the national in that industry. I think that they probably did the same thing almost everywhere.
Also wanted to throw in the Avon in the US does not start creating products for darker skin tones until well into the late 60s. They're very behind the times in that regard. And I wonder how much it might not have been that the US finally realized that they could sell products for skin tones, if maybe it was the international market that pushed Avon US to change rather than the reverse. For African American and marketing, and for women with darker skin tones, their market was primarily for lipsticks and perfumes. Avon always knew that those sold well. So anyway, this is interesting because now I wonder how much it might have, the push might have come from outside rather than inside the country for Avon US to change.
Lindsay, are you going to talk about it later, or?
Yes, that is. I didn't frame my presentation in that exact way, but we're talking 1968 to 1972. So stay tuned for the next presentation. I don't know if I have an answer, but I definitely think they're related for sure. So
We'll come back to it. Jessica, did you want to say something to that? Did I cut you off? No. Okay.
No, I will defer to Lindsay.
All right.
Well, that catches us up the comments in the chat here.
Great. Well, a Zoom round of applause to the comments so far. Let's reconvene at say 15 after 11, which gives you 8 minutes break to do things. And we will promise to continue this because we'll hear from Lindsay and Jessica about that research, which, since I know what they argue, builds off the conversation we've been having. All right, talk to you shortly.